The train ride into Eversnow was uneventful, though the scenery beyond the frosted windows hinted at something untouched by time. Rolling hills blanketed in snow rose like sleeping giants, their silhouettes softened by twilight. The town itself, perched at the crest of a mountain, came into view as the locomotive rounded the final bend, a cluster of Tudor-style homes and narrow cobblestone streets encircling a central square. It was picturesque, almost unervingly so, like a place pulled from the pages of a well-worn Christmas card. I arrived 2 weeks before Christmas, sent by the magazine to write a feature on small-town holiday traditions. It wasn't a story I was particularly thrilled about. Charming customs and quaint anecdotes weren't exactly my forte. My editor, however, thought a fresh perspective would breathe life into the familiar. Stepping off the train, I was met with the kind of silence that presses against your chest. No bustling crowds, no honking horns, just the muffled crunch of snow beneath my boots and the occasional creak of wooden shutters as they shifted in the wind. The streets were lined with twinkling lights and wreaths, but there was a peculiar restraint to the decorations, as if the town were deliberately holding back. At the inn where I was staying, the owner, Mrs. Calloway, welcomed me with a warmth that seemed almost rehearsed. She was a tall woman with neatly braided silver hair and an apron dusted with flour. "You'll find Eversnow charming," she said, setting a steaming mug of cider on the counter. "Especially our midnight tradition on Christmas Eve. You mustn't miss it." "The silent choir, right?" I asked, pulling out my notebook. I had read about it briefly during my research, a peculiar custom where the townsfolk gathered in the square to sing a hymn in complete silence. Mrs. Calloway's hands stilled, the faint clink of her silver bracelet breaking the quiet. "Yes, the silent choir," she said after a moment, her tone careful. "It's our way of honoring the past." "What happens if someone doesn't participate?" I asked, half joking. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, her eyes clouded as if she were weighing whether to speak. "It's not a matter of participation," she said finally. "It's about respect. You'll understand when the time comes." The conversation left me unsettled, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Over the next few days, I explored the town, jotting down observations and interviewing locals. They were polite but distant, their answers to my questions often evasive. The silent choir was mentioned often, but always in vague terms. It was in the town archives that I stumbled upon the first thread of something darker. Old ledgers and faded journals spoke of a settlement nearly lost to an unrelenting winter centuries ago. Entire families perished in the cold, their names etched in brittle ink. But there were gaps in the records, pages missing or torn, and recurring mentions of a group referred to only as the Lost. The term lingered in my mind like the aftertaste of something bitter. Who were they? And why did the silent choir seem to revolve around them? As Christmas Eve approached, the town grew quieter still. The streets emptied earlier, and the air felt heavy with expectation. Despite my growing unease, I resolved to skip the tradition. Not out of malice, but curiosity. What harm could there be in observing from the sidelines? That night, I sat by the window in my room, a blanket draped over my shoulders. Midnight crept closer, and outside, the snow fell in steady flurries, blanketing the square. At the stroke of 12, the first townsfolk began to gather. They moved as one, lips forming words I could not hear, their faces pale and drawn in the moonlight. It was then that I noticed something strange. Though the square was crowded, the snow beneath their feet remained untouched, pristine, as if no one had stepped there at all. And then I heard it. Not the silence I had expected, but a faint melody, distant yet piercing, threading through the walls of the room like a needle through cloth. The night of Christmas Eve arrived, and with it, a silence that felt heavier than any snowfall. The streets of Eversnow were aglow with soft amber light spilling from the old-fashioned lanterns. Snowflakes swirled lazily in the crisp air, coating the cobblestone streets and draping over the gables of the centuries-old buildings like a shroud. There was a peculiar stillness, one that seemed to press against my ears, amplifying the faintest of sounds, the crunch of boots on snow, the creak of a door in the distance, the occasional echo of laughter. I wrapped my coat tightly around me, bracing myself against the eerie stillness, and headed toward the town square. My notebook was tucked under my arm, ready to document what the locals referred to as the silent choir. I had no intention of joining their bizarre ritual, but I wanted to see for myself what exactly transpired. The square was packed, though no one spoke. The townsfolk gathered in small clusters, their faces pale in the lantern light. They seemed subdued, almost reverent, their breath visible in the cold air. A clock tower stood tall above the square, its iron hands creeping toward midnight with an almost agonizing slowness. "Aaron," a soft voice called behind me. I turned to find Ms. Greaves, the kindly librarian who had helped me dig through the archives earlier that week. Her expression was strained, her eyes darting nervously toward the square. "You shouldn't be here if you don't plan to join," she said, her voice low but urgent. I raised an eyebrow. "It's a free country, isn't it? I'm just here to observe." Her gloved hand clutched my arm, and for a moment, her fear was palpable. "You don't understand. The choir isn't just a tradition. It's a protection. You must take part." Before I could respond, the clock struck midnight. The first chime sent a shiver through the crowd, and all at once, the townsfolk turned to face the center of the square, their lips moving soundlessly. It was unnerving, an entire crowd singing in unison, their voices swallowed by silence. I strained to hear anything, but there was only the faint whistle of the wind threading through the square. Then I noticed something. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as the second chime rang out, I heard it clearly, a faint melody, dissonant and mournful, drifting through the air. It didn't come from the townsfolk, their song remained eerily mute. This sound was distant, as though carried from somewhere deep within the mountains that loomed over Eversnow. By the third chime, the melody had grown louder. It seemed to surround me, slipping into the cracks of my thoughts like water seeping through a fractured dam. The sound was wrong. The notes twisted and wavered, as though they didn't belong to any instrument or voice I had ever known. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The townsfolk seemed oblivious, their silent performance uninterrupted. Yet the melody grew louder, closer, as if something unseen was moving toward us. I turned to Ms. Greaves, but her gaze was fixed on the square, her lips trembling as though she too were part of the silent hymn. I grabbed her arm, shaking her gently. "Ms. Greaves, what's happening?" Her eyes met mine, wide with terror, but her lips didn't stop moving. And then, with a jolt, I realized she wasn't singing to join the choir. She was singing to keep something away. A gust of wind swept through the square, extinguishing the lanterns one by one. The darkness was sudden and absolute, broken only by the faint glow of the snow. The melody was no longer distant, it was here. It filled the air, heavy and suffocating, drowning out the sound of my own breathing. And then I saw them. Figures materialized in the swirling snow, their outlines barely visible, yet unmistakably human. They moved with a strange, deliberate rhythm, their heads bowed as though in mourning. Their faces, what little I could see, were grotesque, their features frozen in expressions of anguish. I stumbled back, my legs threatening to give way beneath me. My breath came in sharp gasps as I turned to flee, but my path was blocked. The figures were everywhere, emerging from the shadows, their song weaving through the silence like a spider spinning its web. My pulse thundered in my ears as I realized they were drawing closer, their movements slow but unrelenting. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The melody had stolen my voice, wrapping around me like a noose. Desperation clawed at me as I stumbled toward the edge of the square, my vision blurring with tears and snow. I had to escape. I had to. A hand closed around my wrist, icy and unyielding. I whipped around, expecting to see one of the spectral figures, but it was Ms. Greaves. Her grip was impossibly strong, and her eyes bore into mine with an intensity that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. "Sing," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the melody. "For God's sake, sing." I opened my mouth, forcing my lips to move, mimicking the soundless hymn of the townsfolk. My heart pounded as the spectral figures halted, their heads tilting as though they were listening. The melody wavered, faltering for a moment, before resuming its relentless rhythm. The figures began to retreat, their forms dissolving into the snow like smoke. The silence that followed was deafening. When I looked back at Ms. Greaves, her face was as pale as the snow beneath our feet. "Leave, Aaron," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Leave this town and never look back." I didn't sleep that night. Even back in my small rented cottage on the edge of the village, with the fire roaring and the door locked tight, the melody lingered in my ears like an unwelcome guest. The faces of the figures haunted me each time I closed my eyes. It wasn't just their grotesque, frozen expressions. It was their presence, something ancient and wrong, as if they didn't belong in this world at all. The silence in the room pressed on me, as though the air itself had weight. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling every sound. I paced by the window, glancing out every few moments at the empty street. My reflection in the frosted glass seemed jittery, unfamiliar. The world felt off. Around 3 in the morning, the fire flickered violently, casting warped shadows on the walls. A chill passed through the room, colder than the winter air outside. My breath caught as I heard it again. The melody. It was faint, at first, barely perceptible over the crackling fire, but it grew steadily louder. My heart thundered as I moved to the window, peering out into the snow-covered street. There was nothing. Just the glow of the lanterns and the ever-falling snow. But the song was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside. I spun around, searching the room, but it was empty. The firelight flickered ominously, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The sound was everywhere now, surrounding me, suffocating me. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the room, barely visible in the dim light. Its outline wavered, as though it wasn't entirely solid. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head slightly bowed, its presence oppressive and chilling. Slowly, the melody shifted, growing darker, more discordant. It was as if the very air around me was vibrating with it. I backed toward the door, my trembling hand reaching for the latch. But as my fingers brushed the cold metal, the figure lifted its head. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were empty hollows, blacker than the deepest night. They locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming wave of despair crash over me. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something primal. Suddenly, the figure lunged. I barely had time to react, throwing the door open and stumbling out into the snow. The icy wind hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran, my boots crunching against the snow as I tore through the empty streets. The melody followed me, relentless and inescapable. It echoed through the narrow alleys, bouncing off the ancient stone buildings. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I knew if I did, it would catch me. I turned a corner and skidded to a halt. The square was ahead, eerily deserted now, the clock tower looming above like a silent sentinel. But something was wrong. The The snow in the center of the square had been disturbed, trampled as if by dozens of feet. And in the middle of it all stood a single lantern, its light flickering weakly. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. As I drew closer, I saw what lay in the snow around the lantern: footprints. They were enormous, far too large to belong to any human, and they led away from the square, disappearing into the forest at the edge of the village. A soft whisper broke the silence, freezing me in place. "Aaron." The voice was faint, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was Ms. Greaves. I spun around, scanning the empty square. "Ms. Greaves?" There was no response, just the oppressive silence and the faint flicker of the lantern. But then I saw it, another figure standing at the edge of the square, partially obscured by the swirling snow. It wasn't Ms. Greaves. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It stood perfectly still, its head cocked to one side as if observing me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, it began to walk toward me. Its movements were slow and deliberate, each step crunching softly in the snow. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The melody returned, louder and more menacing, as if urging the figure forward. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My foot caught on something, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the snow. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I scrambled to get back up, but it was too late. The figure loomed over me now, its hollow eyes staring down with a terrible, unblinking intensity. It reached out a hand, its long fingers stretching toward me. A scream tore from my throat, but the melody swallowed it whole. The scream choked in my throat as its fingers grazed my shoulder, an icy, burning touch that sent pain coursing through my body. I lurched backward, slipping and clawing at the snow in desperation. The figure's face loomed closer, those hollow eyes like bottomless pits swallowing every fragment of light. Its movements were slow but deliberate, almost mocking in their control. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding so violently it drowned out the world. The square was a ghostly blur of lantern light and swirling snow, the melody still wrapping around me like chains. "Get away!" I shrieked, grabbing a handful of snow and hurling it uselessly at the figure. My voice cracked against the weight of its presence, my defiance as flimsy as paper against steel. The figure didn't falter. Its arm extended again, long fingers twitching, its hollow gaze fixed on me with a terrible, inescapable pull. But then, a sound. A bell. The clock tower's chime rang out, cutting through the suffocating melody like a blade. For a brief, breathless moment, the figure paused, its head snapping toward the clock tower in a jerking, unnatural motion. I didn't wait to understand what it meant. I ran. My legs moved on instinct, plunging me into the deeper snow at the edge of the square, toward the forest. I didn't look back, I couldn't. The only thing I knew was the heavy crunch of my boots and the frantic rhythm of my breath clouding the frozen air. But the melody followed. It slithered between the trees, no longer distant but breathing against the back of my neck, sharp and malevolent. Branches clawed at me like skeletal hands, the dense forest pressing in on all sides. The snow here was deeper, dragging at my legs, but still, I ran, driven by something primal, something beyond fear. I burst into a clearing and stopped, gasping, my breath steaming in great, desperate plumes. Before me, in the pale moonlight, stood a small chapel. Its roof sagged under the weight of the snow, its windows dark, but it radiated an eerie familiarity, a memory long buried but clawing its way to the surface. The melody faded, replaced by silence so profound it rang in my ears. But I wasn't alone. The snow behind me shifted with deliberate, heavy steps. I turned, dread rooting me to the spot. The figure had followed, its elongated frame silhouetted against the darkness of the trees. But it wasn't alone. Others emerged from the shadows, their faces frozen in grotesque masks of anguish and fear, their movements slow and jerky, as if controlled by invisible strings. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, locked onto me with a collective hunger. The chapel's doors creaked open behind me, spilling faint golden light onto the snow. A whisper escaped, faint and chilling, "Come in." I hesitated, torn between the horrifying figures advancing toward me and the unknown terror waiting in the chapel's yawning doorway. My legs refused to move, my body paralyzed by the impossible choice. But the figures were relentless. Their steps quickened, the snow crunching louder with each second, their hollow eyes burning brighter. With a strangled cry, I turned and threw myself through the chapel doors, slamming them shut behind me. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the scent of wax and decay. The flickering glow of dozens of candles lit the room, casting shadows that danced wildly across the peeling walls. The melody was gone, replaced by a low hum, almost a heartbeat, thrumming through the floorboards. At the center of the chapel stood a figure, smaller, human-like, but distorted in ways that defied comprehension. It wore a tattered robe that shimmered faintly, like frost catching the moonlight. Its head was bowed, and in its hands, it clutched something. A snow globe. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest, as the figure slowly raised its head. Its face was featureless, smooth as polished glass, but I felt its gaze pierce through me, stripping me bare. It tilted the snow globe, and the tiny flurry within erupted into chaos. The hum became a deafening roar, and the walls of the chapel began to shake. The door behind me rattled violently as the figures outside threw themselves against it, their hollow cries joining the chaos. And then, the world shifted. The candles extinguished all at once, plunging the chapel into darkness. The roaring hum collapsed into silence, and for a brief, breathless moment, I was alone in the void. But I wasn't safe. The last thing I saw, faint and flickering, was the snow globe's glow, illuminating countless faces trapped within. Their expressions were twisted in terror, their mouths open in silent screams. And just before the darkness swallowed me whole, I realized one of the faces was mine. The darkness was suffocating, a weight that pressed against my chest and stole the breath from my lungs. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, no sound, no light, no sense of time. Just the cold. It seeped into my bones, far deeper than the winter chill outside, and gnawed at something within me, as though the void itself hungered. Then, a faint glow emerged. A pinpoint of light within the snow globe, pulsing like a heartbeat. Slowly, the glow grew brighter, illuminating the chapel in cold, unnatural light. The figure with the smooth, featureless face stood unmoving, the snow globe clutched tightly in its hands. Its head tilted, as if it were studying me, though it had no eyes to see. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The door behind me burst open with a deafening crash, and the figures outside spilled into the chapel. Their jerky movements were more frantic now, their hollow eyes burning with a sickly green glow. They moved like marionettes, strings tugging them toward me with violent precision. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something hard. The altar. My hand brushed its surface, rough and splintered, and for the first time, I felt something solid, something real, against the unreality that surrounded me. The featureless figure raised the snow globe higher, and the storm within it intensified. The tiny flakes whirled violently, smashing against the glass like a blizzard trying to escape. And as they moved, so did the figures. They froze mid-step, their heads snapping toward the globe in unison. Their bodies convulsed, twitching violently as though caught in an invisible windstorm. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice hoarse, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned the globe upside down. The walls of the chapel groaned, their wooden beams bowing inward as if they, too, were being pulled into the snow globe storm. The candle flames sputtered back to life, casting grotesque shadows of the convulsing figures as they began to dissolve into wisps of smoke, spiraling toward the glowing orb. One by one, they vanished, their anguished screams echoing in the confined space. And then I felt it, an invisible force pulling at me, tugging at my limbs, my chest, my very soul. "No!" I shouted, clawing at the altar, my nails splintering against the wood as I tried to anchor myself. The pull grew stronger, and the room spun violently around me. The snow globe's glow was blinding now, swallowing everything in its path. The air crackled with energy, and the figure with the smooth face began to dissolve, its form unraveling like threads of fabric caught in a gale. And yet, as it disintegrated, I felt its gaze, its hollow, unseen gaze, boring into me, as though it were leaving something behind. With a final, desperate burst of strength, I yanked myself free from the pull and stumbled to my feet. My eyes landed on a heavy iron candlestick on the altar. Without thinking, I grabbed it, its cold weight steadying my trembling hands. The figure had almost completely disappeared, but the snow globe remained, hovering in midair, its storm raging. With every ounce of strength I had left, I swung the candlestick. It connected with a deafening crack, and the snow globe shattered into 1,000 shards. The storm stopped instantly. The glow vanished, plunging the chapel into darkness once more. For a moment, there was silence. Then the floor beneath me began to tremble, a low rumble building to a deafening roar. The walls buckled, the ceiling sagging under the strain. I ran. Snow and debris rained down as I burst out of the chapel and into the freezing night. Behind me, the building collapsed in on itself, the sound echoing through the forest like the toll of a bell. The wind howled, carrying with it the faint strains of the melody I thought I'd escaped. But now it was different, fainter, almost mournful, as though the chapel itself had been silenced. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest, the warm lights of the village visible through the swirling snow. As I collapsed against a lamppost, gasping for breath, I felt something in my pocket. My hand trembled as I reached in and pulled it out. A shard of the snow globe. Its edges were smooth, glinting faintly in the lamplight, and within it, I could see the faint outline of a face, my face, frozen in a silent scream. The melody returned, faint but unmistakable, carried on the winter wind. And with it came the voices. Whispering. Calling. The village lights flickered, one by one, until only darkness remained. I stayed in the glow of the village lights until my breathing steadied, the shard of glass burning cold in my hand. The faint melody, its notes brittle and splintered, teased the edges of my senses, growing louder whenever I tried to ignore it. It was as though the shard itself was alive, whispering memories of the storm that had consumed the chapel. When I finally reached the inn, the familiar warmth of the fire in the hearth greeted me, but it no longer offered comfort. The Christmas tree in the corner, its baubles glittering in the flickering light, seemed garish now, a mockery of the horrors I had witnessed. I slumped into the armchair closest to the fire, gripping the shard in my palm until its edges bit into my skin. My blood, dark and sluggish, welled up, and I let it drip onto the glass. For a fleeting moment, the shard gleamed, absorbing the crimson like a thirsty sponge. The innkeeper, a round woman with a kindly face, bustled over. "Back so soon? You look as though you've seen a ghost." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Did she know? Did she sense the weight of the thing I carried? I went to the chapel, I managed, my voice hoarse. She stiffened, her smile faltering. "No one's been near the chapel in years. It's cursed, that place. Always has been." She glanced at the shard in my hand, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't bring anything back, did you?" I tried to answer, but the melody surged in my ears, drowning out her voice. It was louder now, impossibly so, each note carving its way into my mind like a blade. I clutched my head, but the music only grew more insistent. "Destroy it," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the din. "Whatever it is, whatever you've brought back, destroy it before it's too late." That night, I tried to sleep, but the whispers kept me awake. They were everywhere, in the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the curtains, the soft crackle of the fire. And always, beneath them, the faint strains of the melody, circling endlessly in my mind. When I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the figures from the chapel, their hollow eyes boring into me. I saw the snow globe, its storm raging, and the smooth-faced figure holding it aloft. I woke in a sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The shard was still in my hand, its surface slick with my blood. The whispers had grown louder. I knew then that the innkeeper had been right. The shard had to be destroyed. I waited until dawn before venturing out again, the shard wrapped in a piece of cloth and tucked into my coat. The village was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of Christmas morning absent. Windows were dark, doors firmly shut. It was as though the entire village was holding its breath, waiting. The melody guided me back to the forest, its notes growing clearer with every step. I didn't need to think, my feet moved of their own accord, carrying me to the place where the chapel had stood. Or rather, where it should have stood. The clearing was empty now, the ruins of the chapel gone as though they had never existed. Only the snow remained, undisturbed and glistening in the pale morning light. At the center of the clearing, a faint glow pulsed beneath the snow. The shard in my hand began to hum, vibrating against my palm, as if it were trying to rejoin the glow. I dropped it into the snow and stepped back. The glow intensified, spreading outward in a ripple of cold light. The snow beneath it melted, revealing a patch of blackened earth. The shard quivered, its edges curling inward like a dying flower, and then it shattered with a sound like breaking ice. The glow faded. The air grew still. For the first time in days, there was silence. I returned to the village, exhausted but hopeful. The melody was gone, the whispers silenced. It was over. Or so I thought. That evening, as I sat by the fire in the inn, a soft knock came at the door. I froze, my heart racing. The innkeeper looked up, frowning. Who could that be at this hour? She opened the door, and a gust of icy wind blew in, carrying with it a faint sound. A melody. Soft and distant, but unmistakable. The innkeeper turned to me, her face pale. "What did you do?" Before I could answer, the melody grew louder, filling the room. The fire sputtered, its flames turning blue. Shadows danced along the walls, their movements eerily familiar. I stumbled to my feet, my eyes darting to the window. Outside, the snow was falling again, heavier this time. And in its swirling depths, I saw them, the figures from the chapel, their hollow eyes glowing in the dark. They were coming. That Christmas night, the village vanished beneath the snow, buried by the storm that never ended. And somewhere, in the heart of the forest, the snow globe reassembled itself, its storm beginning anew. They say if you listen closely on Christmas Eve, you can still hear the melody, carried on the wind. And if you follow it, you'll find the village. But you'll never return.